Alright guys, it's time to dive into Painter now. For this video, we will be using the worm score underscore low um, uh, mesh, which was badly UV'd, if you remember correctly, for illustrative purposes, since I want to go basically over everything left, except from the top bit, of course. So once you start your Painter project, obviously the project is an actual FBX file. So I'm going to go ahead and select this FBX, and as you can see, there it is. And we're going to use worm underscore low, not the not the proper UV'd version, but the improperly UV'd version. So I'm going to open this up, and of course I'm going to leave the compute tangent space on. Right? We're not going to bother with texture sets per UDIM file since we don't have any U dimensions. And just for reference, U dimensions mean that you have more than one 0 to 1 space, which would mean that you got a lot of these 0 to 1 spaces, and basically the box of the UVs. So I'm going to load this guy up. And as you can see, there we have it in. Let's take a look at our UVs. And as you can see, there are our UVs. As you remember correctly, this is actually a hard edge. You should be able to even see it over here. This is a hard edge, not a soft one. So it will create a problem since we don't have a seam on it, right? If I remember correctly, you should have a seam on every hard edge, but not vice versa. So this is the UVs that we'll be using. Again, like I said, UDIM is essentially having this square. This is from 0 to 1, right? And a UDIM is basically, would be considering this a UDIM tile 1, U1 V1, and then you'd have a U2 V1, etc., etc. So this would be like a big UV map on its own with different squares where each square represents a tile. That's how you'd be using UDIM. However, since we're not going to be using that, I'm not going to be diving into that aspect. Okay. That being said, let's go back into our object over here. First thing, whenever you import something, and I'm going to just enable my panorama here. So I just want to see something like this. So as you can see, we've got our skybox. First thing you're going to be doing whenever you import something over to Painter is to actually bake some maps. And I'm actually going to delete this layer since we're going to be going over the layer stack a little bit later down the line of this video. So here's my texture set settings, and if you remember correctly, this is fairly simple. We've got our base color, which is only the color information for our material. In other words, the stuff they're going to be exporting. We've got our metallic channel, the roughness channel, the normal, and the height. Now, obviously, if you want to add something, you definitely can. There's a different stuff, AO, etc. It will be generally added on its own. And then we've got the diffuse displacement. This can support displacement maps, and actually there's some pretty cool effects that you can create. But remember that displacement maps generally affect the geometry of the object, so you might need a fairly high poly object, right? And then of course you've got your user define. You could define a particular channel on your own if you want. Obviously there's specular, the levels, the transmissive, reflection, opacity. I don't even know what IO is, but you're not going to be using most of them anyway since they're for different applications. Anyway, in this case, we're going to be starting our bake process, and I will click the bake textures, which is what you should do whenever you import something. And these are all of the maps that are able to be baked from by the Substance Baker. Now, the Baker is shared between Designer and Painter, so whether you bake in Designer and throw the maps over in Painter or vice versa, they should be the bake results would be identical. So we're going to start with the common parameters. In this case, we're going to go for the yellow bit here. The common parameters basically means that everything further down below will be using these parameters on their own. As you can see here, there's actually these little signs denoting that you actually need a separate mesh, like an extra mesh, in order to bake this stuff. You don't need a separate mesh to bake the curvature, the position, or the world space normal. We'll be going over what these mean in a little bit. First of all, let's go over the common parameters. At the beginning here, we've got the output size, and I'm going to put this up to 2K. This is basically the texture resolution of whatever it is we're about to be baking. And we're going to use, obviously you can use a low poly mesh to bake the normal, or anything really, whatever you need a separate mesh. Just click this button and it will use the the low poly mesh. In other words, it will use itself as a reference to bake stuff on top of itself. It's kind of cool. It allows you, it basically means that you don't need to have a high poly for absolutely everything that you make, such as cups, for example, or knives, simple stuff such as this, especially considering the fact that you could paint a lot of details on their own without requiring a high poly mesh. Of course, in many cases, when you have a character or a tank or something that is a little bit more detailed and will probably be viewed by the player in much more on a much longer period of time, such as a gun or a weapon that will be right in front of the player, and especially if you have an inspect button, which allows the player to take a look at it, or some random animations that play with the weapon on their own, you would want to have, as high of quality as possible when it comes to your textures. So here we go. We're going to use the high definition mesh. In this case, we'll be using our properly done worm underscore high, and we'll see what happens. Obviously, this is the same size of a mesh, so we really shouldn't be having that much of a problem. The next down the line is a use cage. Now, I've never used cages on my own, but I did learn about them when I was studying. When I was researching, basically. I wasn't exactly studying at a particular university or anything, but I was looking around the web to find out what this whole cage situation is. Essentially, a cage file defines what kind of shape will the baker use to fire rays against. Now, when we talk about rays, we should as well talk about these distances here. Now, basically what happens is, and by the way, if you've watched the algorithmic tutorials or at least read their documentation, you will know that all of these maps are baked by projecting rays from a particular point of origin down into the geometry itself. Now, whenever you have two pieces of geometry, such as in this case, we've got our high definition and low definition mesh, whenever the ray goes through the high definition and the low definition, that's basically a point of contact, and it allows for the high def to be essentially projected on top of the low def using the UV coordinates, which you have presumably done fairly well in order to avoid some of the issues that we mentioned in the previous video about PBR. The cage file is a custom shape where these rays will be fired from. So in this case, we'll have an actual bounding box around this object, and then these rays will be fired upon from that bounding box. If you don't like the results from that bounding box, you could make your own mesh and export it as a shape. I believe there's a particular method of doing it. Never had to do it myself. I really don't think it's necessary in most cases. So I know if you're really desperate, you don't really like what you're getting, either consider dissecting your mesh into pieces and then using them, over here, adding them on their own. Well, in this case, you just add, you'll just add the one, but you can definitely add more if you desire. And simply matching the baker by name in order to avoid some overlap between pieces. Again, though, most of the issues could be solved by using the frontal and the rear distances. This basically, this says how long will the ray travel. Now, ideally, I usually like to leave it at 0.5. Actually, no, I'll leave it at 1. I'll leave it at 1. Again, this is kind of a finicky on a per basis setting, so definitely experiment with what values work best for you. But generally, you'll be staying within the initial, closer to the beginning of this slider. Now, of course, you got the relative to bounding box, which should turn on. You've got your average normals, which should also leave. You should ignore the back faces. In other words, the back side of the polygon, so you can ignore those. And you should always match by name if you have different meshes. So in this case, our mesh is not dissected, so it doesn't really matter if it's called high or low, since it's just one combined mesh. However, if you do have many pieces, it is generally considered a lot better to bake by mesh name, especially if they match properly. You've got the anti-aliasing setting, so you'd really want to be using the maximum subsampling here if, of course, you want the highest level of precision. It will take a little bit longer to bake, but the results are often worth it. Then you've got the prefix and the suffix when you got the high and low polys. Remember, it doesn't matter what comes after this as long as the name of the meshes matches beforehand. So in your FBX file, whenever you're creating a gun, make sure that you got a, for example, barrel underscore high and barrel underscore low in your high and low meshes respectively. Obviously, it doesn't matter what comes after this, as long as this bit is as long as high or low is matched. Anything in the mesh name, by the way, not in the suffix here, in the mesh name that comes after this, be it with an underscore or with some kind of different capital letters, will be ignored. So you can safely, say something underscore high and then just, add a couple of more identifying words or keywords so you can know exactly what it is, especially if you have a multi-component mesh. Right, that being said, these are all our common parameters. Now we're going to go into normal map, which does not take any parameters, since it basically stems from the common parameters. Reason being is that the normal map is probably the most essential map that you'll be needing, since a lot of this, almost all of Substance Painter's results get merged and rasterized into a normal map. So whenever you have different things such as height or bumps or displacements or whatever, anything that involves changing the view, or not the view, but like the perception of a particular detail, will most likely always be collapsed on top of the normal map, and it will be exported as such. Of course, you can export, you can export on your own things such as height, etc., but you generally don't need them. Next, you've got the world space normal. Now, the world space normal also has no Baker parameters, since it just basically converts the normals from local to world space. It's mainly used for the for the various functions available for you in Painter. So don't bang your head about it. Just bake the damn thing. After that, you've got the ID. Now, the color source in this case is the vertex color. So vertices, if you have painted vertex color on top of the vertices, then definitely use that. However, since we've used materials, we would use the material color. Obviously, you could use also mesh ID and polygon submesh ID. I've never used these two. I don't really know how they work as well. My guess would be that the mesh ID is somehow linked to a different mesh with a different material on it. Anyway, you want to use the material color, and you should leave the hue shift on. Of course, if you want a grayscale, just use a grayscale. Actually, here it says assigns a color per object from the high definition meshes. So you could use the high def mesh over here in order to assign it, or if you use the polygroup submesh, let's call the element from the high definition. Yeah, well, just play around with this if you really want to. Of course, the grayscale will convert the the actual color here into a grayscale if you really want to use that. Though in most cases, it's kind of wasteful. Then again, it depends on what color source you're using. After that, you've got, since of course meshes don't have a color source, so most likely if you use mesh ID or polygon submesh ID, you'd be getting a grayscale out of it. After that, you've got your ambient occlusion, also known as AO, and it works in the exact same way as a normal. Now, it's got the same settings over here, but it also has some secondary parameters which require a little bit of finicking if you want to have a very particular result. The secondary rays essentially mean that once a ray gets fired on top of from this bounding box and hits a particular point, it will then bounce out in a secondary fashion. So in this case, we're really not going to get much of a result, since, well, our shape is fairly flat and our high poly is fairly flat as well, even though it's got some points, and you will clearly see the AO being baked in these sort of holes that we have created. The reason being is that once it hits something that is not smooth, it will bounce at a particular degree, and you just say how many rays a single ray will be split into. Obviously, the more you've got, I think it's up to 1,000, the more intensive the bake process will be, and obviously the more either intensive AO you will get, or depending on the mesh, you might get a better result. Same thing goes for maximum minimum occluded distance. Essentially, well, it is occlusion, so it's fairly self-explanatory. Relative to bounding box should be left on, and then the spread angle essentially means in which direction can a ray bounce off. In other words, the secondary ray could bounce off the the geometry itself. So you should leave that at 180 if you want the best possible result. Then you've got the distribution. I would recommend just leaving it cosine. Uniform is a little bit too boring in my opinion, but it's up to you. Ignoring the back face, same. It's very nice to have it on as well, since you might have some errors. Self-occlusion should always be set to either the mesh name. I mean, self-occlusion should be the same as your normal map, right? So if you've got separate names, you should always use the mesh name as the occlusion, or you could just use always in this case if we've got just the one mesh. Then you've got the attenuation, which linear is just fine. Smooth produces kind of like oily results, if that's an explanation. But just play around with this, see what happens. Obviously, a baking process, a map can always be rebaked. So if you don't like a particular map, just rebake it and with different parameters and see what happens. After that, you've got the curvature. So the curvature is a fairly interesting map. It's mostly used for the filters and functions inside Painter, well, obviously in Designer. But the curvature map works on a per pixel or a per vertex basis. Now, the per pixel is going to be using your sort of normal map, well, technically UVs, with the texture on top of them to figure out where exactly you have a hard edge. Now, since if you enable the seams, which means that by default you should always have a seam on a hard edge anyway, and usually the hard edges are the more dominant edges, so to speak. They're a little bit sharper, so there's a lot of curvature there. They usually denote places where there's a vast difference in the angle between two flat surfaces. So in this case, two polygons. Leaving this on is generally best if you've got good UVs. And then you've got the seam's intensity, which you'd always leave to 1, since of course if your seams are placed properly, you'll get a good curvature. If you got shitty seams, or if you've created some weird UVs, you should obviously turn this off, and so that you don't get the extra artifacts that you might get from the bake. Then you've got the position map, and the position map is fairly simple. It essentially gets the position of each vertex and assigns it to a texture by sort of encoding that position in an sRGB value, since of course this is not a grayscale. Now there's other different methods. You could use a particular axis if you want to be your main axis, and the normalization generally should be left as a B-sphere, since the sphere is a much more good representation of a sort of like a skybox, whereas boxes actually have angles, and you might get some weird results off of it. Again, you should understand that unlike UVs, which technically are positions of the vertices, they are not world positions. In other words, how should I put it? So if you think about this, a UV, okay, is a 2D representation of a vertex. It does not have a position. You can put the barrel of a gun on the top left side, in the top left corner, the top right corner, at the bottom, in the middle of a UV set, such as the square, and you will not have a result different. There won't be any difference in the result during your painting process. Of course, if you have a texture, there will be overlaid on top of the UVs. The moment you move the barrel, you will see the texture move along it, since the texture is stationary, whereas the UV isn't. But the UVs themselves and the shells themselves, they're simply relationships or representations of a 3D space onto a 2D space, meaning that it does not actually convey any information of where it is in world space. So this position will essentially figure out, okay, well, where exactly is vertex B, for example, and that vertex B is 0.5 on the Z, and then it's 0.7 on the X, etc., etc., etc. So it's definitely worth using this. Now, for some reason, my Y here is not the same. It's usually Z is up, so I don't know if I kind of missed a point, but I never actually noticed that there was a difference until now. It's quite unfortunate, but as you can see, the mesh is properly aligned, so there's not really that big of a deal. Then you've got your thickness, of course, and the thickness represents how sort of thick your object is. If you remember the PBR video, we were talking about how far a ray can penetrate. So it's kind of like ambient occlusion, but it sort of casts the rays in the opposite direction, so that you see how long it will take. Well, what's the distance traveled for an object to for a ray to kind of leave the the mesh. Okay, and it gives you sometimes you might need it, sometimes you might not, but in this case I'm going to disable it. And as you can see, it's got the exact same settings as the AO, so I'm not really going to go over them as well. So these are our maps. I'm going to disable the thickness, of course, and we're going to bake them now. And here we go. The baking process has begun. Now, depending on your configuration of the machine, you might have a better or worse baking speed. Obviously, if you have extremely slow machine, I recommend baking at low resolutions and not with no subsampling, and that's fine, because anything can be upscaled or downscaled interactively, so there's no problem with you baking it 256 and then exporting at 8K. Of course, the results will be wildly unpredictable, especially if you're painting in 256. You don't really know what it is exactly that you're doing, since the resolution is just so low. So whenever these maps are painted, they will pop up here on the left hand side, and you can select your own normals or other maps if you've baked them in a separate baker. Maybe you used X normal or some other piece of software. But generally speaking, Substance Painter will do a great job at baking all these maps. Okay, this is taking a little bit longer than I anticipated. Maybe I shouldn't have used the 8x subsampling. But in the meantime, we actually should talk about the reloading of an FBX. Now, the reloading of the FBX is done through the project configuration. And we're going to go over this thing as soon as the baking process is done. This has taken quite a while, isn't it? Generally speaking, you might want to be, if you're iterating, if you're trying different bake processes, of course, don't bake immediately like this. But since I'm not going to iterate on the bake process, I'm just going to get it and use it what it is. Now remember, this is going to be a bad bake. In other words, we're going to have a huge seam over here, since of course we're using textures, and the bigger the texture, of course, the less of a problem you're going to see. But there's no way you can completely avoid it. Speaking of textures, by the way, it's important to understand that the normal map itself and all of these maps have their own resolution, and you cannot really stretch them a lot. So if you think about it this way, if you take a napkin and you draw a car on a napkin, so that car is in 2D space. If you decide to take that car and glue it, if you take that napkin and glue it to wrap it around, let's say something like a fridge, so not a napkin really, more like something stretchable like rubber, for example, right? You have your car and you stretch it along, wrap a whole fridge with it, which is a fairly big construct compared to the actual napkin, so to speak. You're gonna get a very stretched, very pixelated, very badly done car, since it's just the actual resolution of your drawing is a lot smaller than the huge size of the object. So whenever you're obviously, if you decided to wrap an apple or a mug with that thing, you'll get a much better result. So whenever you're creating your UVs and your maps, consider the size of your object. In this case, technically speaking, 2000 resolution, 2000 by 2000 is just ridiculously huge in terms of resolution. Now notice that we actually don't have that bad of a seam. Generally speaking, you will always have a little bit of a problem. Obviously, this is just plain bad. But even despite this, there's actually ways to change the way this looks. You could actually get a much better result depending on what kind of functions and how you really try to hide it, because it is possible to hide it, generally speaking. Anyway, this is our bake over here. Remember, like I said before, use the appropriate size. If you've got something huge, such as a spaceship, don't try to cram everything on top of on one UV, unless you can use some, I don't know, unless by the time you're watching this, you could export 32K textures or 64K textures or something like in that ridiculous manner where it's just obscenely huge, and you could actually have enough texture density to wrap a whole huge object with it. Generally speaking, the bigger the object, the more texture set you might want to need. Okay, let's go over the maps that we have baked so far. So by pressing C here, I can go over the particular channels. Since we don't have any base color, in other words, we haven't painted anything yet, so there's really nothing to show, you're going to see the transparency. In fact, you're going to see the textile density of our object. And it's fairly well done, considering the fact that our UVs are pretty shit. There's no stretching, no warping. There's a little bit of an issue here at the seam, but generally speaking, we're sort of okay. And as you can see, this is where we've been cutting them, as you can see right here. There's definitely warpage, so to speak. But there's no problem since we don't have any textures on it yet. Then we're going to press C again. We're going to go onto the metallic channel, and we don't have any metal information either, since, like I said, we haven't painted anything. Then you've got the roughness channel. Again, nothing. You've got the normal map, the normal channel. In other words, any normal information that we have painted. Okay, this is all the stuff that is in the current project that we have created. And by pressing C again, you can go into height. Of course, if you keep pressing C, you're going to get the whole thing. In other words, the normal, the height, and the base normal. In other words, this is the base normal, right? And then you've got the normal that you painted plus the height that you've painted. But currently we only have a base normal. That's why you only see the base normal. Now, speaking of, of additional maps, if you press B, so I'll just press M here. M, by the way, goes you back to the whole material, to the final result. So pressing B will go through the other setting, the other list of these additional maps. In this case, the first one is the normal map, and this is the same normal we've seen once we combined everything plus that in the previous view mode. So that's a nice little way of seeing, you know, different maps depending on what you've done. Now pressing B again will go to world space normal, and you will see, you know, how these vertices have been encoded with, you know, within the sRGB range to represent a different position depending on the color, you know, the particular pixel possesses. Pressing B again will go to the ID map, and this is the of course the material map that the material assignments that we've created in terms of color in order to use them as masks. Let's take a look at if we have good enough bake. Yeah, there's definitely some problems here, but I think it's for the better, because obviously we don't want to have straight lines. Generally speaking, you don't want to have straight lines, but we do have an issue over here. It's mainly due to the you know, to the high poly being so vastly different from the base shape. In other words, if you remember, the high poly was a lot of the topology was much more complex and had a lot of differences in terms of height between the two. So that's why you're going to get these problems, especially once arrays start firing that direction, and you can see that's one side of it gets shot on the other side. So generally, if you have a problem like that, you should just you know, export your ID map as a separate FBX file. For example, you could take this low poly and add the exact same materials on it in the exact same fashion, or you could even do that in Maya by transferring attributes and then exporting that mesh only with the purpose of baking this ID map. Now, aside from this little bit here, we really don't have much of an issue. Obviously on this side as well, we really don't have that much of an issue on the rest of this mesh. The next, of course, is our ambient occlusion, and here you will see the AO map, how it's been baked. Remember, these are little holes, the little holes in our you know, low poly mesh, sorry, high poly mesh. So they have been baked quite well. Remember, these holes were obviously different, not identical, so there's definitely different levels of shading being present here. And we don't even have that much of that many artifacts here either, so that's pretty cool. Now, once we go into the curvature map, you will immediately see that our curvature has been defined in a fairly interesting fashion. Flat portions of our you know, this is gray, of course, so that's basically flat. There's no curvature on it. Well, there is, but it's very little. Whereas here, when you've got something such as this, where we've baked the curvature from the high poly mesh, you will see that, you know, all the different crevices, so to speak, in our object. This will allow us, especially here, right? This is black. This is a fully concave sort of region of the shape. So depending on obviously the bake and, you know, the shape, you'll get a different result. But generally speaking, this is mainly used for, like I said, you know, different filters, generators, etc., such as functions. Okay. And then lastly, of course, you've got the position map, which is essentially a sRGB position of each vertex. Okay, so instead of the normal here, which represents the position in normal space, sorry, in world space, the position of these normals. This is for the vertices on their own. Okay, so this is also used again for these filters and generators or whatever function you decide to run, right? Then again, I'm going to press M to go back into the regular mode, and we'll be done with our baking process for now. Now, I want to go over to the layers section. This is where all the so to speak, magic happens. This is where the bread and butter is really when it comes to Painter, since the way you stack, overlap, blend these layers, and the way you perform different functions and operations and add different filters to them will define your final result. As such, it's important to understand how this whole thing works. Now, first of all, you can right click on it. You will see that you really don't have much of an option here, since initially you need a layer. Your options are here, such as if you press over here, you can press add layer, and you will see that there's a layer on which you can paint. Now, this is a paintable layer, actually, I should maybe make this a little bit bigger since I want to see the material. Now, this is a paintable layer, meaning that I can start painting on top of it, and it will immediately have an effect. And I've also would have painted on the actual normal here. Speaking of that, if we change the color of our paint, let's say into red, and I paint over here, you will see that I cannot actually get rid of the seam, right? And this is mainly, of course, due to bad UVs. So you really should, like I said, it's another example of why you shouldn't have bad UVs, right? Then, of course, you could also use a color picker if you really want to. Now, I'm not going to go over the properties panel just yet, but just so you know, this is the other part of the magic. This is where all the settings happen for your brush, for your material, the way you define stuff. Now we're going to delete this layer, and I'm going to create a fill layer. Now this is a fill layer, meaning that you cannot paint on it, but much like the bucket tool in Painter, it will essentially fill everything, like the whole mesh over here. So if I decide to say, oh, I don't know, what's my base color, and just say, well, I'm going to make this red, it will fill everything with red. Now in order to actually modify the way this thing works is maybe you could use a mask or some kind of generator or something that will influence the final output of this layer. You have to understand, though, that this layer is also considered a material, since, like I said, I know I said we weren't going to go over the properties, but you have to understand that all of these channels are essentially the same that we've set up over here. You've got your color, metal, roughness, normal, and high, meaning that this is, you can either select a material, such as, for example, aluminium, and it will set all these channels for you. So you've selected a material, and this layer now fills this object with the correct settings, so the correct amount of roughness, metallic, and the color that it needs. If you disable this, let's say I disable the roughness, you will see that all the micro details of the surface are gone, and if I remove the metal, we'll just be left with the color. Conversely, if I remove the color, we'll be left with just the metal and roughness, and basically that's it. So it's important to understand that this is a material. Now I'm going to delete this layer again, and here you will see that it's possible to add a smart material. Now smart materials are groups of layers. Again, if I grab this aluminium here, you will see that it is now a folder of different layers, and as you can see, we've got scratches and aluminium base with some weird stuff on top, like under it. We're going to go over these in a little bit, but just understand that these are different functions depending on what you've selected. So I'm just going to delete this for now. I just wanted you to know that this is a smart material, and by the end of this video we will be walking across, just take a look at a particularly interesting material that has been created by one of the artists in Algorithmic. I think his name was Jeremy something, but he's like one of the league, he's like one of the cool guys, like, very high in terms of skill of painting, etc. Anyway, I'm going to delete this now. We're going to go over the shelf real quick. Obviously, you can also add a group here, and you can add a mask and different effects. You can, add effect, or you could add a particular layer. So let's say if you add a particular layer, obviously most of these things can be accessed by right-clicking, right? You can add a white mask, a black mask, a bitmap mask, which would be, of course, for example, the ID mask would be a bitmap mask. And obviously, you can add a mask with color selection, which is what we'll be using later. And you can toggle it on and off. You can invert the background, the mask itself, clear it, remove it. Fairly simple stuff, really. Cut, copy, duplicate, all that stuff is standard issue across any software package. Then you've got stuff like generators, fills, which is different from the fill layer, by the way. This is kind of like an effect. You've got levels and a filter on its own, and then of course you could add some color selection if you have a bitmap mask or an anchor point, and we're going to go over these once we go through the smart materials in the shelf. Right, so I'm going to delete this now, like so, and we will go over the shelf. First of all, I need to get rid of this texture set list because it's a little bit too big for my liking, and since we're using only one texture set list, I probably even shouldn't be having this here and just have it, for example, in the on the shelf. But depending on your workflow, you might actually have something more complex and you might need to use it, so make sure to have the properly sized window available to you. So first of all, let's go over to the shelf here. Now if I click on all, this will show everything that I have in my shelf, and one way of navigating this is by using the search bar. I'm not going to go over, by the way, how to import stuff. It's a very simple procedure and there's not really much to it. You just import something. You can even drag and drop into it and define it as a particular thing, such as a texture or maybe a filter, brush, whatever. But the search bar is pretty cool because you can add filters. Of course, you can search by default just by naming, but filters are pretty cool since they have these particular objects, right? So you could search by name, you could search by tag or by designation or whatever, right? You can even define your custom search filters. So there's definitely a lot of playing around with this. However, I'm not really keen on just going through with you about simple stuff such as importing and filtering, since in this case they're fairly simple, right? There's just textures, etc. So figure out on your own how to use this if you really want to, but chances are you really don't have that much of a library, that big of a library, in order to require the search. Then you've got the project files. Now these project files are specific to this project. The other stuff is, comes by default with Substance Painter. So over here you see all our baked maps. We can export this right now. It'll work just fine. Well, it will work fine, but it'll look ridiculous. You've got the alphas. Now the alphas are your main way of painting detail, meaning that they're like height maps. They can be, look, alphas can be used for a lot of stuff, since it's a shape that could be defined in many different ways. You could use it as a displacement map, as a height map, a normal. Well, generally speaking, in this in Painter, anytime you paint with a height, it gets converted to a normal, since these textures here, they can be, you can derive all of these, almost all of them, from a normal map, with the exception of position and ID. And so as you can see, the normal map is kind of like your entry point, and the normal map can be generated in Designer and from anything you want. You could create a noise, grayscale noise, and generate a normal off of that noise. So anything that is an alpha can be a normal, and anything that's a normal can be an alpha. So just make sure that you understand that even though these are alphas, they can be used for many different ways. Not to mention, by the way, that you've got different tools, for example, such as Brush Maker here, to make your own brushes. And one more thing, if you want to like more stuff, for example, you want to import your own library, or maybe you don't have a library, you should go to ZBrush.com or some other website. Just Google some stuff and find yourself some free sources of alphas. I think ZBrush have really good quality alphas, and a lot of them. And you can download the stuff that you need and simply import them, or just save them on your hard drive for future use. Notice here, by the way, that it says things such as substance, substance, substance. These are actual text kind of brushes, since Substance doesn't actually have a dedicated text file just yet. Text tool just yet. It means that whatever text you want to add will be, like, you can't change the font, for example, here. So you're gonna have to go with whatever you've got here, or you need to create your own custom font brush, so you can paint with that brush and it will basically say whatever you've written here. There's loads of different other things, like such as, what is this, leak, one drop, and this could be blood, oil, fuel, goo, like anything really. So it's really nice to have this. This is a pretty big amount of stuff just coming in stock. As you can see, there's different signs such as electrical damage, explosive stuff, the eye, right? There's loads of different signs. You can obviously download a lot of them online anyway. So it's nice to know. Then you've got the grunges. Now grunges are generally, you could say that these are procedural maps that most likely they've been generated within Substance Designer, but they can be perfectly tiled and nobody would be the wiser. That's why they're kind of like, they look like this. There's definitely a lot of grunges, so especially since if you could proceduralize them, you can definitely get a lot of good results. So play around with these, look at them. They're fairly useful. Like I said, you can get a grunge map and transform it into a normal map, or use it only for, let's say, the roughness part of it, or whatever. Like, this is a grayscale. It can be used for many different things. After that, you've got the procedurals, which are more pattern-like results. Of course, you still got the grunges over here, as you can see, because grunges are generally also procedural as well, but the patterns themselves require a little bit more finesse. It's not just random noise, but you need some kind of initial pattern in order to tile it around. And there's obviously some other stuff such as camo wood, camo USCP, which is like urban stuff, different checkers, circles, whatever floats your boat. You can even have like something like creased. Maybe you could use this, for example, for wood, maybe, or whatever. Yeah, loads of different uses. After that, you've got the textures, which essentially are the ones that we've just baked, plus some, I really don't know when you would use them. such as skin back, skin bowl, like different skins, skin, loads of different skin. So if you don't bake your own skin textures, you could definitely use those. You even have a mouth skin. If you have a humanoid, which is a significantly more complicated mesh than just a regular worm, since there's really nothing to it, and you, let's say your bake didn't go too well, or maybe you just didn't like some bakes, or maybe you just want to add something, you could use these textures over here. Of course, we've got our the bake textures from the baking process here as well. You got your Fresnel angle adjustments, which is pretty cool. And you've got your different fibers, such as, let's say you've got a cloth and you want to use these fiber bits for, to define a cloth. There's also a sheen noise. I really don't know when you would use that, but maybe if this was like tin foil or foil, you could use that. Then you've got the hard surfaces, which is essentially a bunch of maps, a bunch of normal maps with which you can paint on top of the normal channel, and which will then be collapsed into the normal itself. So that's pretty cool. Now, generally speaking, of course, if you want to add, if you want to change the normal, in other words, let's say you want to hide these seams and get rid of the normal map, you should go ahead and change this to replace and perform the same process that I've showed you in the other video, where we kind of painted on top of the normal map. But that's something really, like, that's a desperate move. Whereas here, since we've got a normal channel as well, we could actually start painting with that stuff, and it will basically be collapsed on top of the normal channel whenever we export. So that's pretty cool, along with any height information that we've added. Difference being that this is a little bit more high detail, so that this actually has more well-defined depth. Okay, that's why it's a normal. After that, you've got the filters, and these are essentially functions which you will recognize if you've used Photoshop at any given point in your life. Well, a little bit more in depth, of course. But let's say you've got stuff like blur, you got directional blur, clamps, sharpens, warps, mirrors, matte effects. I don't even know what that is, by the way. I haven't been playing around with the matte effects. I think it's a separate program that you need to be importing stuff into, or maybe this is just called material effects. Never really used those, but they seem pretty cool to me. But then again, there's a huge software package, so there's a lot of stuff. Now, these filters, by the way, are all created within Substance Designer. You can make them yourself. And the filters are nothing more than simply functions which take an input and give you an output. So in this case, the input would be the regular checkerboard, and the output would be the upsized or downsized checkerboard. Or the warp, for example, it takes a regular image and just warps it. If you take a look over here, you will see the results. Same goes for blur, for the directional, clamp, all these baked lights. You can even change a color map into a grayscale map, etc., etc., etc. Different histograms. So there's a lot of different filters that you can use, and of course, such as even high pass. Here you can see where's the high pass. Where'd you go? Oh, there it is. So it even has a high pass. So that's pretty cool. You got color balances and conversions. Generally speaking, if you don't have anything here that you can use, you can always go into Designer and make your own. Like I said, it's simply a function, much like, let's say, a transformer for your phone charger would be. So if you stick a transformer in the electrical outlet, it will take 220 volts or 120. Oh, there's a glow here. Cool. 120 if you live, of course, in America. Was it 110? I don't know what kind of voltage is. Some stupid shit right there. But point is that this transformer is going to take the voltage, and it will output a lower voltage current. Voltage. And so if you think about this, really, it's not unlike a function. Difference being, of course, that if you know how this function works, you could, for example, edit it and make it your own. In this case, in the case of the transformer, it's basically a wire wrapped around like a metallic sort of like a bracket, right? And the more wraps of that wire you have, the more of a the more basically the amount of voltage that you're going to get on the output depends on how many times you've wrapped the wire around this bracket. So if you know what you're doing, you could just reduce or increase the amount of these wraps and get the desired result off of another transformer. Same way, of course, you could make your own. In this case, you could make your own filters if you really so want to, and definitely worth it to to check them out and see how they all work, because I mean, it's not necessary. Obviously, you don't have to know how a car works or be a mechanic in order to drive a car. Same thing applies here, but if there's something that you don't want or don't like and want to make your own, certainly an option. After that, you've got brushes. Now, brushes can be defined on your own, but there's a lot of presets available. So if I click, let's say, on something like stitches, and actually had a layer here. If I click on something like stitches, it will immediately change the brush section over here into whatever I've clicked on. So a Sharpie, a leather, you could use some mold or whatever, right? Different setups. And whenever you have a, something that you desire, let's say you start with default soft and you go into, go ahead and make your little, basically, do some settings over here. We're not going to go over these just yet, but if you like it, you just right click and you can create a tool preset, a material preset, or a brush preset depending on what you want. Now, a brush preset will take this section over here, everything that you have assigned, everything over here will be taken. It will be applied over here. Every time you click on it, it will actually be saved. So next time you click it, you could actually have these settings loaded over here. When we go to particles, you remember these are the physics based sort of brushes. So initially, of course, you get all of these as a starter, but there's a lot of settings that you can perform in order to get a particular desired result. So definitely look into this stuff if you want to play around with them. And no, you cannot create your own. You can create a preset from this. You can create a preset from these brushes, but you cannot create your own from scratch unless you want to go ahead and download Popcorn FX. And it's a whole piece of software designed to creating these particles. So you're going to have to define stuff. It's kind of like creating material. You need to expose parameters, such as in this case, you've got laser power because we're using laser impact. You've got like fade size, particles, life, etc., etc. So these are all parameters that are exposed by the creator in order for us to tweak around and get a particular result. And this is a very robust system, since you can take something like leaks and turn it into scratches, or you can take something like rain and turn it into what's its face, dents, for example. If instead of rain you want to use something, turn it into hailstorm, right? Hailstones, and just dent the surface by raining on top of it with hailstones or whatever. So there's definitely different lots of different ways of using these, and even such as things like veins or rococo. I don't know what that is, but assuming you can play around with these parameters, you can really get to exactly what you want. That being said, we can go over onto tools. Now, the tool is essentially not only the brush preset, but also the material preset. Now, if you remember correctly, materials were simply fill layers. Okay, so they have their own channel sets over here. So you got your color, metal, rough, normal, and height. Therefore, whenever you create something, let's say in this case they've created a bullet impact, and if we take a look at it, we have loaded the bullet impact material and the bullet impact preset for the brush. Now, both of these create a tool allowing you to quickly set up something you'll be using often. In this case, a bullet impact is something fairly often being used, so you just stamp on top of it, you get the result required. Obviously, there's also different settings over here you can play, such as size, flow, jitter, etc. And you can just keep painting this and just paint everything in bullet holes. This essentially is what it is. There's different stuff such as zippers, screw bolts, even fur, which is a physically like a physics brush, which is pretty cool. You can have fur to it. So there's loads of different brushes available by default. I really don't know what the blur is. I think it just blurs something on its own, but you can define your own tool set over here, and it's a lot of powerful stuff. Now, this shelf, by the way, is stored somewhere on your hard drive separately from your project. So whenever you add something, it will be stored into that folder. You can either do it like manually by going through the Explorer and browsing to that folder, or just doing it through the import over here. And you should obviously, of course, define if it's just for the project or all together during the import process. After that, you've got the materials. Now, the materials are, as previously said, simply fill layers. So in this case, if I take brass pure, you will see that I have my properties only for the material. So this is a pure brass worm, tapeworm or whatever. and only it's basically a regular fill layer. So if we take a look as well at carbon fiber, you could say that, oh, I've added the carbon fiber, but there really isn't much here. And the reason you see these differences here is mainly due to the fact that the brass pure doesn't have a normal map. And therefore, if I go ahead into the carbon fiber and disable the normal map, there will be no difference at all. As I keep, of course, disabling stuff, let's say in the brass pure, so let's say I disable the metal and the color, I will get the metal and the color feeding in from the carbon fiber. Of course, there's different stuff such as blending modes, etc. You could say that, what happened here? Why is my, oh crap, I lost my color. Okay, when I disable it, I lost my color, so I need to set it up again. But as you can see, this is our carbon fiber. Definitely loads of settings here as well, such as parameters, etc. Generally speaking, these are substances, I think, since they've got different patterns. You wouldn't get that from just a regular fill layer. You're not going to get that bit, such as the parameters here. Well, you could, but whatever. Of course, you've got different stuff, and obviously you can blend between them in different fashions. We're going to go over the blending modes really quick in a few moments, along with the fills and the generators. So I'm going to delete this as well, and we're going to go into smart masks. The reason I'm going to skip the smart materials is because I want this to be the last stop in our shelf exploration time here. So the smart masks are essentially generated black and white grayscale images, which operate based on a particular function. So if I go ahead and add a material now and say, well, I'm going to use plastic fabric or whatever this is. Yeah. So let's say I use this now. Since of course there really isn't that much. Notice, by the way, that this is being calculated based on my UV seams, and since my UV seams should be on a hard edge, this should have created something really cool, but since in this case my UVs are garbage, I'm not going to get the desired result. This is another example of when you want your UVs to be properly done. In other words, every hard edge should have a UV seam. That is the law. So if you go into the smart masks, you could say, okay, let's say I want to add some dirt to this guy. Just drag and drop it, and you've got a mask with some dirt on it with some settings in the properties panel. Now, hopefully, by now you would have figured out that the properties panel essentially displays configuration information and sort of sliders and such parameters depending on what you've clicked on the left side here. In this case, this is a regular mask that has a generator, and this generator has a particular set of settings, which obviously I'm not going to go over it, but if you take a look here, it takes all of these additional maps. In this case, we might actually even have to bake a thickness map if we want to get the desired result. So, for example, I could bake a thickness map, and I could use it for whatever it is. Obviously, I could define any map. In this case, I could just say, well, I want to say whatever this is, right? So, anisotropic noise. There's really not that much of a difference if you look at the picture. There's barely any notice here, but a lot of these settings depend on some of this stuff. So in this case, I have my thickness being set to something uniform, right? That being said, these are what smart masks are. And you can define your own, like I said, again, just through creating a mask and then adding a generator, just defining a mask, saving it on its own. But generally speaking, you would want to go through, well, you can't define a mask because these are all substance designer made stuff, but they're pretty cool since they got generators. You could basically save the generator, I think. So I'm going to delete this, and we're going to go into environments. Now this is from last video when we went over how cube maps work, and this is fairly self-explanatory. You grab an environment and just simply drag and drop it over here, or maybe you just change it on your own, such as this, for example, Mondrian. I don't even want. Let me see the blur. Yeah, this is kind of like a mountain range or something. It's pretty cool. Somebody actually took a camera all the way up here and took this picture, and it looks pretty nice. So I'm just going to blur this a little bit, and we can of course rotate this guy to see how light will react. You've got your color palettes over here, your color profiles. These are generally only for your viewing pleasure. I don't think that they are being exported on their own. Maybe they are, I don't know, but I don't exactly remember. So you can activate it. And in this case, let's see. Let's use sepia. So we've immediately created a sepia color profile. I think this might actually be exported. I'm not sure. I haven't needed to play with these color profiles, and therefore I don't exactly have to you know, have too much experience on working with them. But if you really think of creating something such as film noir, you might want to be, you know, looking into it, and you know, if you can export this stuff. Anyway, I'm just going to disable this, and we're going to go back into my viewer settings, and we're going to go into our smart materials. Now, smart material is essentially a group of layers. So if you remember correctly from the last time I did this, grab a glass and add this over here, for example, the glass visor. And if we just drop this further down, you'll see that it's got different stuff such as glowing edges, and this glowing edges has a mask, and this mask has a bunch of generators and blurs, etc. And the final result, of course, is the you know, this material, which is the compilation of everything here. And you can create your own by just grouping them using this folder button here. Group your layers, and it will create a smart material for you, and just dump it over here to save it for future use. Of course, you can go one step further and create substances from Designer and just importing them over here as smart materials. There's no worries with that, but you have to understand that Painter cannot export substances, so it can only export bitmaps. So whatever fancy stuff you do here is only going to be able to work within Painter itself. All right, and this is where we're gonna basically use the final material here, so that we can go over everything left over. So let's just delete this guy and add the hull damage. Now, this is a fairly cool material since it's got a lot of stuff going for it. All right, and it requires a little bit of diving into it to understand how this whole thing works. Now, first and foremost, while we're on the layer stack, I just want to make sure that you guys see the fact that there's all these blending modes over here. They're actually available for everything, including the layer group itself. In other words, the smart material can be blended with other smart materials, etc., etc., etc. So it's definitely a very powerful blending tool. Not to mention that not only the actual sort of objects can be changed in terms of blending modes, but also the masks themselves. They've got loads of different effects over here, and the effects themselves also have blending modes. Like in this case, clouds 1 and clouds 3 respectively multiply and overlay and create a particular effect. Now, the effect you'll see in a minute, but I just wanted to understand that there's a lot of possibility and a lot of power involved in Substance Painter. Now, that's probably not something that I would create, but it's definitely a useful material, and if you know what you're doing, you can create a very powerful, vast library of highly customizable objects or sort of assets. You've got your different layers here as well. So you've got the levels, you've got the fill, which is a fill layer within the mask itself. Here you've got a regular fill such as fire, etc. This adds, this is kind of cool. Anyway, let me just paint over this so we go over this in the reverse order. In this case, I have an object, and I will be painting on top of this layer. I only need to paint with the material, with the color though. And since we're on the properties panel, we might as well go over what we've got here. Now, first of all, you'll notice that I actually don't have anything over here, just nothing. I only have the brush, which is just fine because I want to go over the brush settings. First of all, you've got the size of the brush, which can be modified by holding down Control and by dragging the right mouse button up and down. Left and right, and up and down will change the hardness of the brush. So depending on the hardness of the brush will basically be tied to that. Of course, you could just use, and by the way, this is not a final size. You can make it bigger. Just right over here, you can make it into 1,000 if you want. 100 is just a general stopping point, but it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be just 100. It could be a lot more, right? Then you've got your flow, which is basically, whenever you hold down the button, what's going to happen. You got your stroke opacity. In other words, the opacity of the map, just like these blending modes here have opacity levels. Then you've got your spacing, which is how far between each other the strokes are. And the angle, if you want to create a particular angle for the, for particular objects. So if you're painting with alphas and you're painting, let's say something like hull damage, well, not hull damage in this case. If you're painting something like scars, right, on your object, you might want to be having different angle for your scar in order to operate. I think there was a way to actually change the angle itself. Was there? Let me see here. No, not really. Change size. All right, change rotation with the left. My bad. So you change this angle with the rotation. Up and down changes the rotation, left and right changes the flow. I kind of forgot that to mention that. But yeah, after that you've got the follow path, which is just the path you're doing. You got your size jitters, size flow. Jitters is basically, well, it's easy to understand, right? Jitter is how jitterish, well, random, so to speak, or how much deviation are you going to get from the initial stroke. And there's your alignment. The alignment is very important here, since you've got different ways of aligning this stuff. First of all, you've got the camera, and notice that my brush is essentially working on the way on the camera plane. So here I'm gonna be able to paint like this or whatever. And of course, if you really want to go planar, you could just snap this stuff and just go ahead and paint like this, right? But in my case, I don't need to do that. After that, you've got the where to go. After this, you've got the tangent wrap, which allows the sort of like the brush to wrap around the object, which is pretty cool. Then you've got the tangent planar, which is just using a different tangent space, kind of like on the same plane essentially. And then you've got the UV, which will allow this brush to go along the UVs of the object. Depending on what you're trying to paint, this might be useful or not useful at all. I'm just going to leave it a tangent wrap. This will allow you to, the backface culling is essentially how far, what's the cutoff point for the location. So this is 90 degrees. So since this is 90 degrees here or more than 90, I'm not going to wrap around it, right? There it is. As you can see, nothing is wrapped. But if I go, you see there's just a limit here. So there we go, just so you know. Then you've got the shape in terms of the alpha, so what kind of shape you're going to be using. There's all these alphas here are available. You can just drag and drop them from the alpha section of here. Just drag and drop it over here. It will work. Here's the hardness of the actual shape, how hard it is when you stamp it, and the shape of its own. For example, this is your kind of like a, this is your, what's its face? I've been talking too fast. Not the hard. Well, it is like the soft selection, right? Kind of like this, where you have different presets for your fall off, right? So this is in this case it's a Gaussian, but you can have like this basically like a softness value, but you can have gradation cones, etc. As far as I know, there's no way to set set a your own. And then you got the size ratio for your stamp. After that, you've got a stencil, and the stencil is pretty easy to understand. You just grab something and you use it as a stencil, and you paint over the stencil. There's not much. It works in the exact same way as the other bits. So you can use in this case the anisotropic noise, and you can just add all of these settings here. I'm not going to go over all of them because there's definitely a lot of them to go. But you can tile them, and you can use just play around with these settings. You can look at them on your own, and you'll find out what they work. I mean, what they do, especially since if you experiment with this stuff. And then you've got the most important bit, the material, which in this case is missing. I should get rid of this stencil, which in this case is missing since we'll be painting. It's a fairly interesting setup here. Now I'm not going to go over materials just yet. It'll be at the end of the video. So just in order so you understand, materials generally have available all the channels that you've enabled over here. So in this case, we've got base color, metallic, roughness, normal, and height. And over here, we've got color, metal, roughness, normal, and height. If I add an emissive channel, actually, let's just add an emissive so that you can see what happens. Let's say I add an emissive color. Boom, I've got an emissive color over here, and I can paint on all of these at the same time or just on that one. So depending on what I have enabled, I will be painting just on that color. So currently I only want to paint on the color, roughness, no, I only want to paint on the color. So if I go ahead, now this should work. I haven't used this before, but generally I think this should work. So let's go ahead and try this. And unfortunately it is not working. See, what this is supposed to be doing is, oh wait, why am I, oh, I don't have a particular color. Oh Jesus, I need a color. Dude, give me a color, will you? This is very weird. I should have a material color over here. Oh, please don't be saving this stuff now, will you? Okay, well that's kind of embarrassing, I suppose. Let's just add a, let's see what happens when we add a regular layer here. What's wrong with you, boy? Okay, let's select just a brush. There we go, there's a brush. I kind of lost my materials which has never happened to me before. I can't even add it here. I have no selection. I think it's time to report a bug. I think I've just encountered a bug. Or maybe I did something really stupid, but I've never had this happen before to me. That's quite interesting in its own right. Now let's see if I add another material. Then what's going to happen if I add this bone crystallized material? I should have the material. There it is. This is my material. So maybe this will fix it. Will it? No, my brush is still kind of screwed. Why do I not have a material? What if I select the tool? There it is. We've got our material back. Okay, so I'm just going to delete this, and I should be able to have a material here in my painting. Okay, there we go. Let's use the blur. Oh, I used the blur, didn't I? That's what must have happened. Yes, the blur has no material, so I got stuck with the blur. My bad, guys. I forgot that I've selected the damn thing. Okay, so this is our brush. Let me just use something standard such as default soft, and we can continue with the video. I was kind of worried. I have to set a fucking bug report here. So here's our paintable mask, and again, we're going to go over this real quick. I'm going to disable the height, the roughness, the metal, just use the color, and I'm going to be painting with regular white color, so like this. Now this white color should be able to provide me, since I'll be painting on the mask, I should be able to see how these different things work. So let's go ahead and take a look, and this is our hull. So I'm painting on top of this, and then if I paint on this again, I should be able to see stuff under it. If I keep painting, I should get the actual wiring at the bottom. And what if I increase the hardness of it? Sorry, my bad. No? Okay, this is working in a very weird fashion. I'm not seeing anything here. Definitely not seeing anything. Okay, well, essentially what I wanted to show you guys is that as you keep painting, this really shouldn't be an issue here. For some reason, I'm not getting the desired result, but maybe I'm just too thick. I've never used this material before. This is a brand new addition, at least for me. I've never seen it before in this section here. So the idea is, right, that as you keep painting, you're going to be peeling away at these layers. First of all, you'll see the smoke, then you see the sub-hull. In this case, this is the sub-hull, and of course after that you'd see the wiring, which is, you know, as you can see here, it has a fire, so it's kind of like fiery. It is an emissive color, so perhaps I need to enable my emissive channel. Yes, there it is. So yes, I kind of painted all this stuff over, but as you can see here, if I begin from here, first I've got the bit, then I can keep painting and keep painting, and of course you know, you're not really seeing the intensity of the color yet, but that is because I haven't actually set up my you know, emissive intensity. So this is what it is. This is the hull damage, and it's a really cool setup here. And obviously you can change the you know, for example, the flow. You want it to be a lot less, so the flow is like how hard you're pressing against it. So here's my flow, and it's been reduced significantly. And as you can see, as I keep painting on top of this, I'll keep you know, exposing more and more at the bottom. It's pretty cool for a spaceship, for example, since this looks like something ridiculous right now. And remember, you can use a different brush, right? You can have a different preset. It doesn't have to be this particular brush. You could use, let's say, something like dirt, and just paint with dirt, right? And you're going to be getting the required result. Now, how does this whole thing work? By the way, when I'm with on the material subject, let me just go over here and enable all of these so that you can see what I'm talking about. Now, a material, by the way, is, like I said, a fill layer, right? So in this case, if let me just grab a particular material. Let's see, aluminium. Let's grab an aluminium here. So this is the material of our spaceship. It's aluminium, and then it has been damaged. So I could even sell it as a spaceship if I really wanted to. But look at it this way, okay? You've got the normal and the height emissive disabled, since this particular material doesn't actually use it. But if you did, you could use all of them, of course. And this is the cool bit. I'm going to disable this, by the way, for now, since I want to just show you something. Generally speaking, you could disable these, you could kind of bypass these by going through the projection method. In terms of this particular object, you've got your UV projection, which is essentially taking the picture and projecting on top of these UVs here. Since we've got hard edge here and there's no UV seams, you will be getting an issue. However, there is a way to sort of bypass this, and depending on how bad your UVs are, you might actually not work for you, but you could go for triplanar projections. Now, triplanar projections are a little bit better, but they create problems again, as you can see here, since our UVs are just pretty shit on their own. And you can configure these triplanar projections generally if you're using the advanced triplanar filter. And I will go over this with you for now, but let me just leave this at the filtering. By the way, is how good of a quality you have. So if you use the sharp bit, it's like the nearest bit. It basically depends on a more pixel level, but just keep it at high quality. As you can see, there is a slight change, right? The nearest is kind of shitty, the sharper is a little bit better, and the high quality is the best. The UV scale, now by default I've set it on 1, but you might have it at 3. The scale is essentially how many times you've tiled the image. So in this case, I could tile it like this, right? For some reason, I do have this sort of a seam over here, so I really don't know. Does it have anything to do with the mask? No. Let's take a look here. Yes, well, we do have that problem since our UVs, again, are pretty garbage. So we're going to be running into this issue fairly often over here. Well, actually, this does not have to. Maybe we have a very hard edge, and that's the way it works. But like I said, we'll try to bypass this in a minute. After that, you've got your UV offset. In other words, how which way does this thing go? So in this case, we could just move it up and down, around, whatever you like, and you can rotate this stuff in this fashion, like this. And of course, you've got the hardness of the seam. So the hardness of the seam here. This is a seam here. For some weird reason, I really don't know why we're getting this, since we shouldn't be getting it here. Obviously, the softness will sort of like soften the impact of this material. Then we've got the channels mapping. So let's say you've got a base color. When maybe you need a base color, you can map it to a particular mask. All of this stuff, and you can just, the channels mapping is like, let's say I want to take my metallic and turn it into specular or glossiness, right? Or use a different map. You could definitely do that. This is kind of like remapping your channels. Then you've got your parameters. In this case, you've got a random seed. You can randomize it every single time. Well, once it reloads a couple of times. Then you've got your colors. So you could change the color for this. Let's say I want it to be sort of like a little bit darker, maybe something like this. You've got your color borders. If you have a particular set of color borders, this is kind of like snapping. This is kind of like leveling, like a level's working, so you could snap against them. And you've got how metallic or rough your substance is. So in this case, let's say I don't want it to be as metallic as I want, and I'm not going to get the metallic. It's not going to be as metallic as it is right now. Since this is a substance created a material, that's why you have these parameters. Generally, you won't be having these parameters on your own when you do stuff within Painter. That's not to say that Painter is too weak to create the same effect. It's just it's a method of work. It's a methodology. Then you've got your pattern. You can say, well, I want to tile this however many times on its own. So you could grab this, and it should be tileable. Can I just say 3 times? There we go. So it creates a little bit more dynamic of an effect. You can decrease the fold intensity. So let's say I don't want this to be that foldy, and I don't want this to be so intense in terms of its grid-like fashion. You got your technical parameters after that, and you can say, well, I want my normal to be fairly overwhelming, so I'm going to max it out. Really no need for a height range, and I need to change the position of my height. In other words, where is the neutral? So in terms, right now, gray is kind of like the neutral bit, but you can obviously change it depending on what your preferences are. So this is regular ass material. And of course, if I disable all of this stuff and I grab something very simple, and delete this really quick, actually, maybe I shouldn't. I'm just going to disable this for now because I want to use the triplanar stuff. Let's grab again the platinum pure. This is something you can do on your own, right? As long as you got a base color, you can just grab the color and define it. And then you've got grayscale, such as how metallic something is, right? In this case, it's completely metallic or non-metallic at all. and something such as roughness, how rough something is, in other words, how well it reflects light. And, well, not reflect light, but how much light scatters on the surface of this object. In this case, it's very rough. Here, it's completely shiny, right? And again, like I said, these are all figured out already. Now, again, you can use a particular material, and you could use a different projection. So let's say we're going to try triplanar, and there's really no difference since, our UV is a shit. But I'm going to show you a little trick where you might be able to fix some issues. Again, you can select a particular material here in the base color. So you could, sorry, not material, but a mesh. So let's say you want to use this. This is your base color from now on, and this is your texture essentially. And again, you can play with all these settings here, such as capsule length, etc., etc., etc. I'm not going to bother with this. And then you've got the material mode. You could also select a regular material, or you can reference something. Again, as you keep enabling these things, you'll be getting more and more channels to be adding to your material. Eventually, have all of them. So if I have an emissive color, maybe something like this, this will be glowing, right? Generally speaking. Let's see, if I move this, it's not going to be very glowing, but if I max it out, I'll be getting some emissive of it. So yeah, this is the whole material set. So if I go ahead now and select a tool, such as, for example, the bullet impacts, you will see that it's got. Can I just? Well, I need a paintable layer. So let me just go ahead and select the paintable layer. So if I select the tool, you will see that I've got all of this stuff available to me. So this is all your spots where you'll be setting up these things. Now remember, this part is the brush, this is the stencil, and this is the material. You can save all of them. You can save all of them in a fairly well understood fashion. In other words, it'll allow you to either save just the brush, save just the material. By right-clicking here, you can either save the brush, the material, or you can save both as a tool. This very powerful way of working, since it eliminates a lot of repetition when it comes to reconfiguring particular tools. So let me just delete this layer, and I wanted to show you one little bit here. I'm just delete the platinum as well. I want to show you one other potential way of fixing a seam, hopefully anyway, is by adding a particular set of effects. Now, first of all, as you remember, you've got a generator, a fill, a level, and a filter. Okay, and of course you can paint as well. Now, generators work only for masks. So if I were to click here, add generator, I wouldn't really see anything to do here, because let's say I grab a 3D dimension, there's not really going to do much. You need a mask for generators. So you could add them to fill layers, but they're not really going to do much, since you need to be working on a mask, right? So generally speaking, you want to be adding masks, and let's say I add a mask here. Let's say a black mask, and I can add now a generator, and I will get a pattern. So let's say I grab this generator, and I say, oh, I don't know, I want some, whatever this is, right? And you'll get a particular result depending on what this mask is looking like, right? So that's the idea behind generators. Now I'm going to delete this mask. Where's my... by the way, you can create smart masks as you create, let's say you stack 3 or 4 generators, because you can keep stacking them, right? I can add another generator, and I select this generator, which is like, I don't know, light, right? And I select this generator, which is something else, such as dirt, right? And I can maybe change the, for example, this could be a pass-through. Where's my pass-through? There it is. Let's say this is a pass-through, and then this is kind of like a linear dodge, or lighten, or whatever, and I get a particular result in my map. And of course, let's say in the dripping, I could just leave it at normal. And then whatever I'm happy, I could just export this smart mask and leave it over here in my smart mask section. But I'm just going to remove the mask. So what we can do as well is add, obviously we can add a different fill, and this fill will be much like a layer, but it will be working on top of the fill itself. So it has the same settings as a regular fill layer, but it is part of the effect stack. So here, for example, this is a fill layer with fire, right? If we enable this, you'll see that if we just use this fill layer, you will see only the fire itself. And of course, after that, you've got the emissive color, which has a particular value in terms of color, right? So in the fill layer here, I'm just going to remove this. You can have the same settings, but what we really want to do is create a different projection type in order to sort this out. This means that we need to add a filter. Now filters can work both in regular layers, and of course they can work on masks. So if I add a filter here, it's, as you can see right now, it's going to be empty. But in this case, I want to be using an advanced triplanar projection. So the regular triplanar didn't do the job. Let's try with an advanced triplanar. Now the advanced triplanar is going to get some, it's going to give us some weird results initially, but as you fiddle around with it, you will get much better results after a while. So let's see what we've got. We can use a random seed for these things, but there's no really a point. We need to project, let's say, only across the x-axis. This is going to basically spread everything across the x-axis, and it should at least a little bit eliminate our object. Although, well, not that much. Let's say if we do this only across the y, it's still a little bit visible, but kind of saving it already. Maybe z, this should be, well, the z is just, it's not going to work for us. So we're going to use the all axes here to project it across everything. And we could change, let's say, the blending mode to advanced to give it a little bit better blend with the upcoming here, the object. And we could use the blending contrast, the texture tiling, or we could just set up what the axes you want. So in this case, let's say I want to offset the x. I'm just going to leave this back at linear. Let's say I can offset the x on the y here. I'm not getting much of a result. Let me just see where we're working on. We should be working on the z-axis because our object, this is z, is high. Can you keep offsetting? No. Maybe offset it on the y as well. No. See, funny thing is, the y here is pointing upwards, but because our object is for that object, z is upwards, so it's kind of weird. But then again, here z is we're moving across z, right? So this is z and y. And this is an x. You can obviously rotate this stuff, as you want. So this is more of a manual way of projecting things, right? You can offset the x, for example, something like that, maybe. I don't know. Keep offsetting it. Just rotate the damn thing. See what happens. Right? But this is essentially a way of playing around with your object in a more advanced manner. So this is like a hands-on type deal. And if you really want to, you could sort this out. Definitely, it's not. Nothing is to say that you won't. It's just, a little bit more work to get it done. Okay, advanced triplanar, regular triplanar will generally do the job, unless of course you want to project across a particular axis, and maybe just randomize this. This should randomize it. I'm not sure why it's not doing that, but yeah, you could, for example, scale this out. Since we're only working on the z, you can rotate this guy a little bit more, just offset it for some weird ridiculous reason. This kind of tiles it, offset the y on it. Yeah, this is not looking good at all. I should check, then I think I should just project it across the x, but whatever. Point is that you've got a lot of availability to work with, and you could fix some issues here. Like this doesn't look that bad compared to this, but it's still quite evident that there's a problem here. So whenever it is you're making something, make sure to make it, to get it done right. Obviously, you've got the same channels here. You can enable, disable channel. Maybe we don't want the height to be projected, right? Maybe no roughness or no color or nothing really. And in this case, you just got the basic stuff, okay? As you can see here. Obviously, you can project it again from the color, but it's not going to be working if you disable everything. I'm going to delete this anyway, and we could use the triplanar projection here, since generally this does a pretty good job. And yeah, the final note, by the way, I wanted to mention, obviously there's loads of different effects here. You could also add a levels, by the way. Now levels generally work for anything. So in this case, since we've got an sRGB image, we could actually use levels on particular things. But if we take, for example, the height, as you can see, the height here is, by the way, it can work on the luminosity and something else if you've got sRGB. But generally speaking, this is our output range, right? So you could change different data based on the height. So in order to see this better, let's go ahead and go into our height. And let's say we decide to blacken this guy out. Well, in this case, we're using actually the extra maps, sorry. Where is the damn thing? We're working on it. I'm missing something here. I just blacked out the whole thing. Come on, dude. Oh, there we go. So as you can see, we're doing some modifications. So we're modifying the darkness over height, and now we're going to get something like this, right? So the levels work on anything really. It could be an sRGB image. It could be, you could work on the metallic bit of it, which is also kind of like a grayscale. So anything that is not sRGB, you'll be seeing this kind of color here. But anything other than that, you'll be seeing definitely other things. Sorry, we're working on the roughness, so we need to go ahead and take a look at the roughness channel. So this is what we've done so far, and obviously levels are good for exaggerating or desaturating different, well, how should I say, different aspects of a of an image. Since clamping the white by blowing them up, the whites, you get a like a dimmer white. If you max it out, you get much whiter whites, and if you just keep dimming the blacks, you get even more white. So it really depends on how you want to work with the outputs and inputs, and just define your middle point like this, and you can get something like that. Maybe you could use it for whatever. Maybe this is going to be your emissive map. Maybe you'll be working on your emissive map, and you'll be using your height channel, sorry, your roughness channel, to figure out where is stuff. So yeah, definitely useful, especially for especially for what's its face, especially for masks, since they're black and white, and you can get a lot of bang for your buck using levels. That being said, we're on the final point of this video. We'll be talking about the anchor. So as you can see here, we've got a paintable mask anchor, and the reason these anchors were invented is because if you wanted to apply something further up the stack, it was kind of difficult to reference things. Like it had, sometimes you might arrive at a problem where you have to just move something upwards, but then it would break something further down. So you needed some way of referencing things. As you can see here, if we take a look at our mask, in fact, both masks should have a anchor point reference. And as you can see, there it is. It even gets highlighted over here, grayscale, and it currently references the base color and the alpha behavior that keeps the alpha. You can even use the levels to set up how this whole thing behaves. If we take a look at the paintable mask, this is what our references are. We're basically painting on the wiring, the subhull, and the mask at the same time on the smoke. That's why it allows us to create this complex material and just work with it. So you could play around a lot with this and really get some great results. Not to mention that, of course, all of these things have their own projections. So let's say I could use this and just do a triplanar projection, and this could be a triplanar projection, but if you see, the thing is, there's no way to set the triplanar on everything. So if I select these two, there's really no way of changing the projection type of all of these three, for example. So I would have to I'd have to go ahead and grab this and just do this by hand on each one, which is a little bit annoying. But generally you won't be having that many things to worry about. And if you're having triplanars, you have to triplanar, then you can just use it on a per usage basis whenever you're adding something to the layer stack. But essentially, the anchor creates a reference point which you can then add to a particular thing, such as in this case the mask. So essentially, this created a fill layer, and in the grayscale, you're feeding what you're doing here. So you're painting the grayscale all over the place. This obviously works with everything and anything in most cases, roughness, whatever. So you can definitely get a lot of bang for your buck when it comes to anchoring. Right, so there's that, really, guys. That's all. I mean, I'm gonna leave you at this, since you should just play around with this on your own and experiment and see what works and what doesn't. Maybe figure out your own way of utilizing different filters and effects. Since in this case we've got a blur effect, and you can just figure out where it is. So we're blurring some of this wiring stuff out based on a mask, and the mask, by the way, is here. So we're kind of feeding this over here. So this it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool, and if you really know what you're doing, you could get a very powerful result out of it. All right. So there's that, guys. Remember, you want to be using the ID. Oh yeah, Jesus, last thing, I forgot about the ID map. So let's say I want two different materials. That's when you'll be using the IDs. We've already done this before, but I wanted just to hammer this down to understand that it's much easier, and you're not going to be taking that much memory by using just a single texture set instead of having two. So let's say I grab something like, leather rough. So we'll be grabbing the leather rough here, and we will use sci-fi PVC as the secondary. Okay, So we need to create a mask in order for the sci-fi PVC to be sort of showing itself through a particular mask. So I'm going to right click here and I'm going to add a mask with color selection. Currently the mask of course is black, meaning that it's completely transparent. I'm going to pick a color and the ID mask will be loaded. I will pick this color and now we should have the way you know, this leather impacts, you know, our object here. Now there's loads of different ways you can you know, modify this. You can just keep adding different filters, effects, right? You can even use a levels, for example, to change how intensive this is. So let's say I add a levels and I just start playing around with this. If I take a look at my mask, you should be able to currently working on the mask. So as you can see, I'm just lightening this out, or maybe I'm just doing this on the opposite way and just want to kind of reduce my whites. Well, technically I'm all white, so if I have something painted, I could do that here as well. So if we take a look at the roughness here, I think we're working on the roughness, aren't we? Oops, where are you? There's the base color. As you can see, we're getting different results based on the masks here. So using the levels is pretty much the same as what's its face? Using the mask is pretty much the same as a as in Photoshop. So if you ever use masks, you can get, you know, pretty good results. So this allows you to segregate different areas of your mesh and just work with them. As you can see, we only have very little range over here from one side into the other. You could reset this whole thing, of course, to get it to a much better reverse. You can invert the whole thing, by the way, as well. So that's pretty cool. If you invert, of course, you change the black with the white, and this changes the mask. You don't even have to. You don't need the levels, by the way, to invert this. You can just invert the mask in itself. So you can see you can invert mask and it should do the exact same thing. So the levels will be inverted on this side. So it just saves you a few clicks of time, right? So there's that, guys. That's pretty much it, what I wanted to talk about. I think I've covered everything. Really, this was kind of like a long video, and I think I've missed my training session. But what I wanted to say is that it's a very big, it's got a lot of potential, this software, but it's not that hard to understand on how to use it. So you've got your whenever you need to create something, the procedure is very simple. You just bake a couple of maps, then you start with a fill layer. You don't even need a library. You could just start with a regular fill layer, add some colors, right? Define particular channels. In this case, I have an emissive, so you have a fill layer. You want to add a particular color. Let's say something like a green, right? Something like that. Don't make it too bright. There's no need. You can have a particular set of metallics. So this is a little bit metallic. Maybe it's not that rough, or maybe a little bit too rough. You could use a normal, which is, you know, let's say you can be painting stuff. Well, in this case, you don't want to be painting stuff, but you could use the normal for, you know, whatever. Like if you want to be influencing the normal channel with a particular map, such as, let's say, I don't know, maybe this. I have no idea what that is. Oh, this is a bevel capsule. Let's see if I've got my regular normal. What is this? Grid cross. So there it is. There's one thing here that I got from the normal map. And then you could use a particular height map or set up the height of the object itself. Let's say we've got a checker height map. So we've done something like this. What else? You got your emissive, by the way, here, so you could add particular emissive colors, or if you so desire. Obviously in this case you can't paint on it, so you kind of limit it to what you can do here. Of course you can just select the mode, or you just change the projection as you're here as well. So this gets a much better result, as you can see now. Instead of just using the UV projection, you get a much more uniform result of whatever it is you've made. Then you could create a mask, for example. Let's say a black mask, completely transparent, and you want to add some generators to it, so it creates some interesting kind of like thing. We could just grab a smart mask from here and just dump it over here. Let's say we want some dirt, and just dump it over here. You've got some dirt, so the dirt has a particular setting here, and then whatever is at the bottom will be the dirt color. So you could create another fill layer, drag it at the bottom, and let's say this would be your dirt color, and you can go into your color here, just enable the color, for example. Or at the bottom, maybe you can even invert this mask if you wanted to, right? Grab this brownish color, something like this maybe. Oh, actually this is a paintable layer, so you'd be painting with this stuff on top of this, and this could be kind of like your dirt. But of course, if this was a fill layer, you just have a fill layer here, or you could add a fill effect here. And you could do the exact same thing. Of course, if you need to move it further down the stack in order for this thing to apply. So you got your fill there. Currently it's grayscale. I think there was a way to have a color. Was there a way to have color for the fill? Oh no, of course you can't, because you're working on a mask. But if you had, you could add a fill layer over here, for example, and then you'd have a particular effect based on this stuff. So let's say I want to fill this red, so that's what I'm getting, right? But then again, this completely overwrites our initial fill, so this kind of defeats the purpose, unless of course you have a different mask here, right? So you can add a filter or generator, something like that, that could maybe create a mask for you. So there's loads of different ways to work, and I highly recommend you just play around with this. Again, whenever you create a layer, by the way, you will notice that you're painting also with a material. So not only you're painting with the brush, but you're literally painting with the material. So you can paint on many different channels. In this case, I could be painting only just on the color and no need for height or emissive, right? So this is what I'll be getting. Or maybe I could paint with a color and emissive, and I want a little bit of roughness in it. So let's say I want to be painting with a fairly high roughness, and I want my color to be emitting well, blue in this case. So if I go ahead and paint this, now I'm going to get this pinkish color. If I add the metallic bit, it will automatically add the metal channel to it. So whenever I decide to change the metal channel, and this is going to be more shiny, I'm not going to be painting with a new value. This is going to change the original value. Okay. If I take a look here, maybe I try to change the color to, let's say, this one, and now I can paint on top of it with that color, right? Maybe I want to increase the metallic and the roughness. I'm going to be painting with this. Now obviously that's not, the emissive is pretty ridiculous. I'm going to remove it. I'll be painting without the emissive. As you can see, much more different results. And in this case, because I'm not painting with the emissive, but my emissive color remains, you will see that my previous paints actually remain. So that's one thing to consider. Actually, I think I lied to you. It does not, your previous strokes do not get changed whenever you change these options here. Okay. That's one thing to keep in mind. Of course, you could just use a stencil and just add maybe something. Maybe you want to create a an arrow, or in this case, let's say I disable this entirely. Just disable these entirely, and you create a layer map, and you want to start adding some details. So let's say I go into the alpha channel here and just select this over here and just start clamping. Well, obviously I have I have a lot of jitter here, right, in terms of size, spacing, my flow. But as you can see, it does the job. Obviously, you need to change some of these settings here, so you don't want to. You can invert it, by the way, as well. So that's pretty cool too. You can get an inversion. You can different bends, offsets, whatever floats your boat, right? Probably no need to for jitter on the size. You don't really need in terms of opacity. So in this case, let's say I don't want any flow jitter. I don't want any angle jitter. So I just want straight stamps and just say boom. Well. Okay, size jitter as well. Boom, and these are our stamps here, right? So you could obviously rotate this stuff by using the control. Where's my thing now? I always get it confused. There we go. So you could rotate this like that. For example, you could get your bearings and just snap it over here. You don't have to work with an alpha. You could use other avenues. For example, in this case, I'm painting with color, metal, and rough. Maybe I want to be painting with a normal. So if I paint with a normal, I've got my color here, and I should be actually painting not with the uniform. Maybe where's my hard surfaces? Let's say grab this. What am I doing here now? I think I've been talking for way too long, dude. But yeah, you can paint with the normal, but it has to be on the normal channel. So look, whatever. The point is, it's a fairly simple process. Okay, the point is that you get to work with whatever it is you've set up on the material. So you can be painting maybe you don't even have to paint with the color. In this case, I could paint just with the metal, and let's say this is a metallic version of it, right? Or maybe I could paint just with the roughness and say, well, I want to be painting a lot of roughness on it. Obviously, both of these are maxed out now, right now. When it comes to the normal, I could be painting with something like this. Should be sort of fine. Of course, if I want to do that, I would need to remove my alpha. So let's say this is my alpha removed, and now I can add a, like a stamp. Obviously, you wouldn't want to have something like, like not a lot of. You could have a little bit of transparency, but you don't want to have a lot of softness. You want to have a hard, you You want to have a hard, so like, where's my softness here? Not the flow, yeah, sorry, my bad, flow, there we go. So you don't want to have something like this, okay? It's too transparent. You want to have a hard, sort of, like a stamp, okay? You don't want to have something like this over here. So there's that, right? That's definitely, that is not a good way of doing this. You want to have a maxed out alpha. As long as this is square and white, you're good to go, all right? Okay, guys, that being said, I think we should, you know, get on with this since it's kind of long. It's been an hour and a half probably. And I think I've gone through everything that you guys might need. And by the way, look at our normal map now. There, this is the stuff we've been painting, all right? As you can see, I've actually even added this paint over here. Obviously, it didn't have any data here. It was just a flat one. That's why we had this issue, all right? And of course, if we take a look at our normal combined with the emissive, since we haven't painted, plus the height, we should have had the height. We didn't actually paint with height, now that I think about it. So let's say we decide to paint with height, and I'm going to remove this because I want to paint just with the height, and I'm going to grab my alphas, and let's say I'm going to use this. I can paint with the height on the height channel. Where's the height channel? Well, obviously I'm not painting with any height, so I could use this and just paint. Where's my? Oh, I'm on the normal. Okay, so there's my height. As you can see, it's pretty cool, right? And afterwards, if I combine this, you should see that the height gets complicated, you know, added to it. All right, guys, that's been it. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you guys next time when I will either work on the regular version or I will just change the, I'll just change the format and just speed run it through the whole thing. See you guys next time. Bye-bye.